To the casual visitor, possibly entering the ruins of Reading Abbey for the first time, most of what is visible is just a jumble of flint blocks with little discernible form. However, the chapter house stands out as an identifiable building and is the most complete part of what remains of the abbey. You enter through an arched doorway with two more openings on either side. Once inside, the walls are remarkably intact, and although there is no roof, there is a feeling of being in a great enclosed space. At the far end, there is a rounded wall, and despite a large gap at its centre, the visitor feels secure inside this hall. Indeed, this was the Abbey's great hall, or aula, where the monks met several times a day. What do we know about this space, the chapter house? It was big, very big. In fact, there is a case to be made that it was the largest in England. Let's look at some statistics. You will see that the largest chapter houses are between 2,000 and 3,000 square feet, or 200 to 300 square meters. First of all, I have to warn you that different websites, even the official websites of some cathedrals and various reference books, do give slightly different measurements. Nevertheless, these numbers give an idea of the comparative sizes of some of the major chapter houses in England, some still standing, some in ruins. If we now look at Reading, you will see that even the most conservative estimates place Reading at the top end of the scale. This plan shows where the chapter house stood in relation to the other monastic buildings. Its distinctive shape makes it easily identifiable both at ground level and from the air. It also bears some comparison with other contemporary chapter houses. Winchester, for example, at 310 square meters, was one of the largest in the country. It was considerably older than Reading, dating to the 1080s. And unlike that at Reading, it was rectangular. But the two do share some architectural features. Both stand to the south of the church. There is a slip or passageway between them and the south transept, and access is by the cloister. The standing remains, which you can see here, consist of several arched Romanesque openings. These don't quite fit in with what we shall see at Reading, but the concept is the same. Reading's shape is probably due to the influence of the Cluniac Benedictines, who Henry I asked to build his great monastery. Its rounded apsidal east ends are a feature of Cluniac design. This is a convenient point to explain what the chapter house was and how it fitted into the life of the monastery. There seems to be a lot of confusion about whether Reading was a Benedictine or Cluniac monastery. The explanation is in fact very simple. The Cluniacs were Benedictines. That is, they followed the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia. He lived in the 4th century and wrote a way of life, a rule for monks who, unlike the Desert Fathers who lived solitary lives, came together to live in a community. And of course, any community needs to have its rules. But there were different ways the rule could be interpreted, such as whether work meant just physical labour, or if studying and singing divine praises could be considered work. The Cluniacs stressed the importance of the work of God, the Opus Dei in Latin, chanting the divine office and engaging in lavish ritualistic ceremonial. The Cistercians, another Benedictine order founded in the 12th century, on the other hand, laid greater emphasis on physical outdoor labour. There were many other branches of Benedictines, that is, those who followed the rule. And so, chapter houses, such as this one at Canterbury, were not just places of prayer, but served as a monastery's administrative hub, where the community members met daily to discuss the business of the day. But we must keep in mind that the spiritual aspects of the monastery's life was their main concern. These two illustrations of Durham show what Reading's chapter house would have looked like, the first being the ground plan and the second the apsidal east end. As part of Henry VIII's reformation of the English Church, Reading Abbey in 1539 ceased to exist. Its dissolution with the expulsion of the monks meant that the abbey no longer had a role to play in the life of the town. Some of the monastery's buildings were converted into other uses, including a royal residence. There are sound historical records concerning its destruction and disposal of its material assets. This has been written about extensively elsewhere. So in this next and last group of slides, I will look at the post-dissolution evidence concerning the chapter house. There are two main types of evidence. The first, the written records, which includes everything from casual observation to thorough archaeological reports, and the second consists of a variety of illustrations, sketches, and finally photographs. The first written report, which specifically mentions a chapter house, comes in the Parliamentary Survey of 1650. Towards the end of the 17th century Civil War, Parliament carried out a nationwide survey of Crown lands, which now passed into the ownership of the Commonwealth. In Reading, this included the old Abbey. Here we read about a great old hall. The question is whether this is indeed referring to the chapter house. The words great hall often refer to the chapter house. This term backs to the 13th century, at least. There's reference to the aula in the commemoration services for Henry I. On one hand, it may seem strange that the chapter house should be used as a refectory. On the other hand, we know that it was used as a meeting place, such as when Parliament convened there and when Edward IV announced his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. It may also be considered equally unlikely that the refectory should be handed over for the feeding of the poor of the town. This was an event that took place on the 1st of each month in commemoration of the death of Henry I. As these two buildings are so close, the chapter house and the refectory, it is interesting, whichever is being referred to, that there was a large cellar in the area. We see here how Stukely describes the chapter house. Stukely is one of the earliest, in fact probably the earliest illustrations we have of the Abbey. The measurements are slightly greater than later and contemporary ones. Also note the error about Henry's burial place and that of Queen Adeliza. We know for certain that Henry was buried in the chancel of the church, and Queen Adeliza likewise, not with the king, but rather to the side in the chancel. If Stukely's drawing is accurate, note the ashlar stone blocks, which are still in place at this time. The windows are rounded. This latter feature needs to be borne in mind when comparing it with Englefield's account, which we shall see later. We should also note how the curvature of the vault shafts start at ground level. The standing remains and other drawings show that this was not the case. This view shows a chapter house behind part of the refectory wall. We can see the three western openings, with two complete windows above. To the east, on the far right, can be seen two of the great windows in the apse of the chapter house. The western windows appear rounded, whilst those in the apse may be pointed. This needs to be read with Englefield's statement in mind that all the windows appear pointed. I am perplexed by the refectory wall, which should at this time have reached further west. Perhaps the artist was allowing himself some liberties in order to give a view of the openings into the chapter house. Englefield's survey was described by Slade in the 1970s as the first factual survey and the starting point of modern studies. The survey consists of 7 pages of analysis and a detailed map of the standing ruins at that time. I have heard it say that his plans are a bit hit and miss. On the contrary, they are very accurate. As you can see from these images, when I overlaid a modern aerial view of Englefield's plan, there was an exact match. This, in fact, allowed me to uncover a hidden pillar base in the north transept. This has proved to be the most complete on the whole site and is especially valued by historic England. So what can we learn from Englefield's survey? We read a detailed description of the chapter house, and that he thought that the windows were pointed rather than rounded. That is typically Romanesque. This is a controversial detail, but one that should be kept in mind. Another point is that Englefield was sure that the barrel-vaulted roof was sustained by 5 stone ribs, and the vaulting infill was made of tufa. Most of the stone in the Abbey is from the Tainton quarry west of Oxford on the River Windrush. It is an oolitic limestone, whereas the infill consists of a tuffus formed by some petrifying spring and enclosing the impressions of twigs, etc. One leaf is very fair. Some samples of this have been found in the area, namely of a much lighter calcareous nodular spring water deposit stone. These two illustrations date to 1791. That on the left is looking from the east of the chapter house. It is possible to see where a great hole has been made in its apse. Nevertheless, the outer frame of the 2 windows can be made out. The other, on the right, is another view, this time from the inside, looking west towards the town. If the representations are accurate, the windows had deteriorated much since the 1773 illustration. In 1802, Coates collaborated with Englefield in writing the section about the Abbey. Englefield redrew his original plan, adding greater detail. Coates' description of the Abbey and chapter house is taken from Englefield's report. John Doran's work was published in 1835. The National School, which had been built within the walls of the chapter house, and by 1837 had been closed, and its house was demolished. The Van Sittart family, headed by Nicholas Van Sittart, Lord Bexley, owned much of the area and was thinking of demolishing the ruins, drive a road through it, and possibly build some houses. The Berkshire Chronicle railed against these plans as an idea worthy only of a Goth or a Vandal. Reading Corporation created a trust to buy and manage parts of the ruins. The trustees were evidently conscious of the need to protect the ruins from further deterioration. The corporation bought the chapter house and the south transept. However, they ran out of money. James Whebble stepped in and bought much of the remaining land, including the area that is now the eastern part of the Forbury Gardens. Between 1837 and 1840, he went on to build St. James's Church. This was in the area of the north transept, with the young A.W.N. Pugin as its architect. The measurements differ slightly from those given elsewhere. Once again, this may be owing to different points of reference. However, note that Doran considered that the west end openings were all doorways. In the 19th century, we come to the period of photography. This is one of the earliest photographs of the chapter house. It shows what may be pointed windows. As ever, though, one must remember that this does not mean they are the original openings. Contrast this photograph with the next, taken in the early 1900s. There is considerably more vegetation, especially around the upper windows. This would be the cause of more deterioration and structural damage. Despite the variations in different measurements, there is no doubting the imposing size of Reading's chapter house. At around 3,300 square feet, or over 300 square meters, it was one of, if not the largest in England. Before undertaking the major restoration of 2017-2018, Reading Borough Council engaged Stuart Harrison to undertake a survey of the ruins. I will be making frequent reference to this in the next section. Although certain aspects of its architecture have been interpreted in different ways, such as whether the windows were pointed, there is little doubt but that the chapter house was built in the so-called Romanesque style. The ceiling was most probably barrel vaulted, and the decoration, such as the blind intersecting wall arcade, as seen at Wenlock Priory, is typical of that period. However, we should recall that the mid-12th century was a transitional period, and places such as Durham had what I will call proto-Gothic features, with pointed arches and vaulting. I will now examine evidence from the standing ruins themselves, and their analysis by Harrison, and the historical record from previous commentaries and illustrations. The west end consists of 3 ground floor arches and 3 windows above, of which the outer 2 are complete, the central opening having lost its top courses. Illustrations show that this was the case by the 1720s. The doorway. There is evidence of 3 stepped orders. In all probability, there would have been a hood mould above. The windows on either side indicate the existence of at least 2 orders. The lower windows, the window to the south of the doorway, according to Harrison's 2015 survey, shows signs of a flanking order at each side and a projecting core along its centre line. This must be related to the plate tracery subdivision of the main opening into 2 sub-arches supported by a central shaft, so says Harrison. The possibility of plate tracery raises the question as to whether this would have been glazed. Harrison goes on to point out that the sides of the windows have socket holes showing where the capitals have been removed. The sills, that is, the arches over the openings, are of a more modern date. The upper windows and the walls above them, he says, are almost entirely modern fabrications. The upper windows, these would have looked out above the cloister. They appear to have had 2 arch orders. However, most of the flint work is modern. Once again, it is useful to refer to the illustrations that I showed earlier, dating from the 18th century. Once inside the chapter house, and looking back at the interior west wall, we note the following. The upper flint work is a later construction, not the original. And secondly, the curvature of the barrel vault would appear only just to clear the window heads. Harrison suggests that to compensate for this, the ceiling web may have been angled slightly upwards. If we recall that these are not the original windowsills, and that Englefield was convinced that what he saw in the late 18th century were slightly pointed windows, then I am not sure we can be certain as to the exact nature of the vaulting, especially in relationship to the windows. Harrison's survey, with suggested outlines in red, shows the original openings and the problem of the arching of the barrel vault as it hugs the windows. When we come to consider how the walls would have been decorated, we can be certain that the upper windows would have been glazed, and almost certainly this would have been with lavish stained glass. The light of the setting sun would have bathed the interior in spectacular colours. This illustration shows the north wall. The red lines indicate the position of the pilaster responds or shafts which supported the vault springing level sockets for the capitals and abaci. These were of separate stone and supported the transverse rib arches which would have been the backbone of the vault across the building's 12+ metre width. As for the wall surfaces, it is very likely that they would have been painted in much the same way as we see in the chapter house at Westminster Abbey. Finally, the outline of the double-tiered bench can just about be made out, though in early photographs it is far more prominent. The barrel vault, as at Durham, extended to where it joined the apse vaulting. The apse was divided by 6 supporting pilaster responds with central shafts into 5 bays. From the surviving remains, there is little we can tell about the interior appearance of the chapter house. However, by comparing it with other similar buildings, it is arguably possible to build up a representation of its likely appearance. To begin with, it is necessary to remember its purpose. All the main customaries of similar monasteries mention the central role that chapter house played in the life of the monastery. The whole community gathered daily each morning. They would sing prime, one of the little hours of the great office. It derived its name from being the first or prime hour of the day. Because it was partly sung in the chapter house, it was known as the office of the chapter. The list of martyrs dating to the earliest days of Christianity, the martyrology, was read, along with the necrology, that is, the names of the community who had died. Accompanying prayers for the dead were said. Reading's first monks had been, as we have seen, Cluniac Benedictines, and praying for the salvation of the souls of the dead was central to Cluniac life. A chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict was also read. This gave its name to the building. The English word chapter comes from the Latin word capitulum. The abbot or prior would have given a sermon or homily. Sometimes this was taken from one of the fathers of the church, such as St. Augustine. We know this was the case at Reading. If required, the business of the day would have been discussed. The importance of the chapter house in the life of the monastery is evident in that it is mentioned in the very first lines of Cluny's customary. This concerns the election of the abbot. They state that the whole community is to gather in capitulo. The new abbot's reign began in this place. It was from the chapter house that the monks would make their many ritualistic processions to the main church and around the grounds of the monastery, and to which they would return. But the chapter house at Reading was also a meeting hall, the Great Hall, the Aula. It was here that Edward IV announced his secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and Parliament met on several occasions when it fled London to avoid the plague. And so the chapter house was a centre both of prayer and business. It is not certain if it is in this chapter house that it is being referred to in the account of the commemoration of Henry I's deaths, but it was either here or in the refectory on the 1st of every month, an even more elaborate ceremony in December, the actual month of Henry died, the 13 poor people of the town were fed with a special meal. Doubtless special hangings and cushions would have been added to the furnishings on these occasions. They are mentioned as decorating the church for the commemoration of Henry's death. It would be almost unthinkable that the windows did not have lavish stained glass. The walls had been richly painted with biblical and other religious themes, and as the church was dedicated to the Virgin Mary and St. John, and of course by the third quarter of the 12th century the abbey had become a centre of pilgrimage to St. James, and the hand of the relic was of special veneration. The ceiling itself would most probably have been painted. It is unlikely that it would have been seen with a rich mosaic such as Monreale in Sicily. The two-tiered seating area may have been of stone or wood, possibly with wooden backs fitting into the intersecting blind arcade. In the centre there would have been great double-sided lectern. Here a magnificent volume containing the martyrology would have been placed, and with other books as they were read or sung. The abbot's throne would have been at the centre of this great apse. We can be almost certain that many of the monastery's abbots would have been buried in the chapter house, along possibly with other dignitaries. One mystery is whether there was a crypt. We have seen that the 1650 survey mentions a great old hall with a very large cellar under the said hall. Could this be the chapter house, the refectory, or some other building? Whatever lay beneath it, the floor itself would have been laid with encaustic tiles. These may well have been produced locally. There are known to have been tileries dating to the 12th and 13th century in Reading, some having been recently excavated in South Reading on Silver Street. We have seen that the Reading chapter house was at the heart of their monastic life, both spiritual and temporal. At times it would have been a space for prayer and meditation, at other times, as it hosted royalty and ecclesiastical dignitaries, it was a place of pomp and lavish decoration. The great hall would have been rich with warmth as shadows mingled with dancing shapes created by streams of light filtering through its stained glass windows, and beeswax candles, their glow shimmering through the incense-laden air, bringing life to the brightly painted murals. The chant of the readings, the sound of the bells, and the clinking of thuribles would have created a haven of peace, a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem. Let us close by listening to the sound of one of those chants that for over 400 years echoed round this magnificent hall before its final desecration.
Sa